December the 6th is the 29th anniversary of the massacre at École Polytechnique in Montreal. And on that day, 14 women were singled out of their engineering classrooms and they were systematically killed. And the National Day of Remembrance reminds us of the issue of violence against women and calls on us, I think, to reflect and to act. Because violence against women and girls in Canada, in our communities, in Calgary, remains a persistent and stubborn issue. For me, when I think back on that day 29 years ago, what was particularly tragic about that event was that the women were young, bright university students starting out their career. And schools and universities are places of possibility. They're the great equalizer in terms of not only gender, which is certainly speaks to that particular day as well, but the great equalizer in terms of socioeconomic class, ethnicity, just society. Knowledge is power. And so women were seeking equality in terms of their education and their knowledge and their profession and their future. And that future was cut short by a perpetrator who very clearly said, this is a war against feminism. And it remains the largest mass shooting in Canadian history. And I think that most people forget that. It's critical to keep the conversation going about violence against women because I think it's all too easy to minimize, to marginalize, to say, but it's 2018. The world's so different. I don't need feminism anymore. We don't need to worry about violence against women. That was ancient history. What's not ancient history, as we see from the Me Too movement and by more women and girls and men and boys raising their voices. There is a persistent and pervasive and insidious spectrum of violence against women and girls that happens every day. And it's not just women and girls that know, it's also men and boys who know as well. And it's this awful secret that's not so secret that we all know about, that far too many girls and women are not safe in their own home. They're not safe in their communities. They're not safe in their schools. And it can be everything from unwanted touch and harassment, certainly all the way up to the ultimate, which was what the Day of Remembrance, what December 6th memorializes. And so I think as someone who has worked in this field for almost 30 years, sometimes I get tired of just the talking. Certainly we need to talk, we need to remember, but we also need to act. And so for me it's critical that not only women and girls reflect and act and talk about this, but also that men and boys join the conversation, because otherwise we're only having half the conversation with half the people in the room. And I think that in order to effect change, because ultimately what we want is for all of us, girls, women, men and boys, to thrive in this community. Domestic abuse remains a critical issue, an absolutely critical issue in the city. And again, I think it's easy to marginalize, to minimize, to forget. There's so much nowadays that crowds for our attention. But at the end of the day, the number that I always remember right now in my head, the number that rolls around is 18,500. And that's the number of phone calls that Calgary Police Service received last year for assistance for domestic violence. And that's a staggering number, if you think about it, 18,500. That's about 50 calls a day. And so for me, there's a couple of things when you peel back the layers of that number and thinking about Calgary in particular. It's a great city, and a great city of opportunity and prosperity and hope and privilege, and yet there were 18,500 calls for help, and we know that maybe 10% are actually reported to police. There's a small percentage that actually connect with 911 for help. And so those were only the phone calls where someone was able to get to a phone, felt that in that moment a phone call would help. And so I think that the staggering enormity of 50 calls a day, but then the question we have to ask ourselves is how many went unreported that day, and what does that mean? And then I think also that as we start to peel back that layer, even in terms of our own community, that's an awful lot of police time and attention, that police walking into situations that are potentially dangerous, that are loaded with emotion and with fear and complexity. And imagine where else police time could be if there was more respect and there were healthier relationships in our families and in our communities. And so it remains a persistent and critical issue in the city, not only because of its actual occurrence, but it's the effects. It's the ripple effect, and we see that every day at the YW Calgary. And you don't have to work at the YW Calgary to see it. It's in every home, every family, every community, schools and workplaces. And it affects not only the victims profoundly in terms of their physical health, their mental health, their well-being, their ability to move forward with their life, but it also affects the perpetrators, and then it affects the systems around us in terms of emergency responses, in terms of social services, in terms of the health system. There is an inordinate amount of resources and time focused on supporting people through the issue of domestic violence. YW Calgary from its early days has existed to help families, to help women and their families who are struggling with domestic violence. And the first and most obvious is that we operate a 24/7 crisis line. And so that phone number is part of a network of other shelters and service providers in the city. But the YW Calgary is there 24/7, 365 to be able to support victims as they reach out to say, I need help, I'm scared, I need to know what my options are. And from that crisis line, we also offer shelter and housing and counseling. And if you think of it in terms of a ripple moving out, it's from that most crisis intervention, sort of the immediate help, shelter, safety, access to resources, but then also as well, it doesn't stop there. You know, someone's life is so profoundly affected by experiences of domestic violence and abuse that there's more. And so then it's about longer term health and recovery, and it's about counseling, and it's about education and employment programs. And so I'm particularly proud of the continuum of services that we offer to be able to wrap around families who have experienced domestic violence, and we offer programming for both victims and perpetrators. For every woman and child that walk through the doors of Sheriff King Home, they have a unique story with their own unique experiences and emotions. And so I think that typically we will hear and we will see the range of emotions. Women and children who come to us with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their back. And women who may have planned or not planned. And they will come to our doors seeking safety, seeking reassurance. And what we hear from them often are things as simple as, I can actually sleep tonight knowing that my kids and I are going to be safe. I've got someone to help talk with me. I've got someone to listen to me. I have somebody who can help me think about what next. because I think that unless we've been there ourselves, we can have no idea of the complexity and the emotional burden that those women and children are carrying with them. Sometimes they're worrying about their pets that they had to leave behind, or it's not uncommon for children to be wondering, will I see my friends again? Will I get to go back to school tomorrow? What does this mean? Often there's overwhelming fear and sadness and anger and confusion. There is also strength. There is also resilience. There's also determination, and there's also hope. And so I think that we at the YW Calgary are there to welcome and support everybody who steps through that door and what they bring, and to help them move forward on their path. On the National Day of Remembrance, 2 actions that people can take. First and foremost, to educate yourself. And I think to learn as much as you can about the issue, to learn about the signs, so that if you know people who are struggling, and to know what the resources are. And then I think secondly, the greatest action that people can take is to support the organizations that are on the ground doing this critical work. And there is an incredible network of organizations that do profound work every day that often goes unnoticed. And so supporting those organizations however you can is vitally important.